Lincoln had a small amount of military experience. He served a minor role as a quartermaster. He didn't see combat in the Black Hawk War against the Native Americans in Illinois. And now he was thrust into the role of overseeing Northern strategy. Eventually, he comes to rely on a material advantage, simply that the North has more equipment and more men to destroy the Confederate Army, because honestly, his strategy was terrible. Initially, his plan is to try to take land. It ends up being to just try to kill men. Lincoln is a disaster as a commander-in-chief. He runs through a series of commanders, some of whom he drives off, none of whom he gives really unconditional support to until his final one, Grant. His first choice is Winfield Scott, the man who had ultimately won the Mexican-American War, but he's just too old. Now, Scott does kind of win the war, even though he's only in charge of it for a few weeks. He devises the Anaconda Plan, a naval blockade to prevent any shipping in or out of the South. And this is probably the single most destructive thing the North does to the South during the war. But Winfield Scott retires, saying he's simply too old to lead. Next, he's going to turn to George McClellan, who will train a great army, but will be severely hamstrung by Lincoln's paranoia. Now, McClellan gets a rap for not being willing to fight, but you have to understand that McClellan is ordered to attack the Southern Army, but at the same time always be in position to defend Washington, D.C., because Lincoln lived in mortal fear of D.C. being directly attacked. And so McClellan is essentially kept on a tether, which really short-circuits most of the things he tries to do. And occasionally Lincoln will actually show up where McClellan's army is in the field and start giving McClellan specific orders on what to do. And quite frankly, Lincoln didn't know what he was doing. McClellan was replaced by Halleck, who's just a complete incompetent. And it won't be, and he'll go through more commanders. This is just a few. It won't be until March of 1864 until he finds Ulysses S. Grant. We'll talk a lot more about Grant later. Lincoln is in turn a bit hamstrung by Congress, who creates a committee on the conduct of the war, and they often interfere with Lincoln and his decisions and his ability to run the war. And so, in terms of political leadership of the war effort, the North is kind of a mess. The South was something different altogether. Jefferson Davis had been a soldier, a real soldier. He had fought in combat. And he believed very clearly that he should allow his commanders to do what they needed to do. By 1862, he had found his man, Robert E. Lee, the only man ever to go through West Point with a perfect military record. He was widely agreed by both sides before the war to be the great military man of the age, and that largely turned out to be true. Lee would be in charge of the Army of the East, the army that will fight around Virginia and Washington, D.C., while Braxton Bragg will be in charge of the Army of the West. Lee is an interesting man. He freed his slaves when he rode off to war. Lincoln, who had offered Lee a command in the Northern Army, Lee turned that down by saying, "Mr. Lincoln, I am an American, but I am a Virginian first," which really says something about the importance of states as opposed to nationhood at the time. But Lincoln will take Lee's estate, his plantation, which was called Arlington, which is just outside of Washington, D.C., and he'll turn it into a graveyard for Northern soldiers. Lincoln does this as a petty move to try to kind of insult Lee by burying Northern soldiers in his plantation. Lee will respond by saying he's extremely honored to have these brave men buried in his plantation, but that's the kind of man Lee was, widely admired by pretty much everybody who knew him. Officers on both sides are drawn from the same pool, West Point. Pretty much all these guys went to West Point, the high-level command anyway, and they were all friends. They studied the same textbooks. They had the same professors. In some cases, you have battles where the commanding generals on either side. There's one battle where they were the best man in each other's weddings. So these were people who all knew each other and were very, very close in many circumstances. Amateur officers will play an important role too. And there are some cases where men will rise from basically raw recruits to significant positions in the war. Two that come to mind are Lawrence Joshua Chamberlain of the North and Nathan Bedford Forrest, the great, although despicably racist, Southern cavalry commander. The Union, I should say, controlled the sea. They were able to blockade Southern ports and prevent both the sale of cotton and other exports and troop movement. The South, desperate to dislodge the Northern Navy, will resort to new technology. The ironclad will be a normal ship covered in iron. It's pretty simple, right? You see it there. You see how low it sits in the water because of all the iron. The South will invent this, and their first one will be called the Monitor, and it will smash through everything it comes across until the North responds with the Merrimack. And in March of 1862, the two sit in the Potomac River and fire their cannons at each other, but neither is able to hurt the other, and it leads to a draw. But ultimately, the Union Navy will win out, controlling not only the coastline but the rivers as well. The South will actually invent the submarine and the torpedo in a desperate attempt to break the blockade. Neither of them worked very well. Torpedoes actually had to be propelled by people who would swim and then kind of push the torpedo towards the boat and then try to get out of there before it blew up. And the submarine, tragically, doesn't work, and all the men who go out and asphyxiate and die. But it was the first submarine. The Secretary of State, that means the chief diplomat of the South, is Judah Benjamin, who incidentally is Jewish. The Secretary of State of the North is William Seward. Benjamin was not dynamic. Seward was. The Europeans liked the Confederate States due to its cotton ties and the desire to create a rival for the U.S., but France was waiting to see which way Britain went. And Britain was hampered because Britain had gotten rid of slavery a long time ago, and there was a significant abolitionist movement in Britain who had already wanted America to get rid of slavery. Britain might have helped the South in the end, but the Emancipation Proclamation made that impossible. The Emancipation Proclamation made it clear that the North was anti-slavery and prevented Europe from getting involved. Unfortunately for the Confederate States, the Europeans had just discovered Egyptian and Indian cotton, and this made American cotton worth less. If the war would have happened maybe 10 years earlier, Europe may have been more interested in helping the South. So this is kind of a bad break, ultimately, for the South. In 1861, the Confederate States, Mason and Slidell, these are two diplomats, are captured off of a British vessel, the Trent, the HMS Trent, by an overzealous Union commander. Lincoln ultimately has to release them and apologize, as Britain is threatening to join the war on the side of the South. Britain does sell 6 warships to the Confederate States, and later the U.S. will sue for damages done by these ships, a case that won't be settled until 1877. But the Trent affair comes probably as close as anything to getting Europe to get involved in the war on the side of the South.